The air inside the old barn was thick with sweat, smoke, and desperation. Rain pelted the tin roof above, and muddy boots stomped across the creaky wooden floors as villagers crowded in to watch the auction. It wasn't livestock on the block today. It was people. One by one, the poor and the outcast were led to the stage, debts to pay, mouths to feed, and lives bought and sold for a handful of coins. At the far end of the stage stood a woman, her posture stiff but graceful despite the burlap sack tied tightly overhead. Her dress was torn at the hem, her bare feet muddy, and her wrists bound with coarse rope. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't even move. Her stillness was almost unnerving. The auctioneer, a thin man with a crooked hat and a voice like gravel, slammed his hand on the podium. Strong woman here, good for cooking, cleaning, and field work. Who'll start at $10? The crowd muttered. A few men leaned forward, squinting at her like inspecting a horse. One man spat on the floor. Too quiet. Could be deaf or dumb, someone said. Or scarred under that sack, another whispered. The auctioneer's face reddened with frustration. $5 then. 5. Who'll take her? Silence. At the back of the barn stood Thomas Grayson, a broad-shouldered lumberjack with a thick beard and eyes as cold and deep as the forest he lived in. He rarely came to town and spoke even less, but something about the woman's stillness pulled at him. She wasn't like the others, there was no fear in her stance, only a quiet dignity. $2, Thomas said, his voice low but steady. Heads turned. The crowd broke into laughter. $2? For her? You could get a pig for that. The auctioneer scowled. $2? Are you mocking me, Grayson? No, Thomas replied flatly. $2's all I'll give. The auctioneer hesitated, then slammed his gavel. Sold. To the lonely lumberjack. As the crowd jeered, Thomas stepped forward. He untied her hands but left the sack over her head. Come on, he said gruffly. The woman didn't resist. Silent as a shadow, she followed him out of the barn and into the storm. The storm raged on as Thomas Grayson led the woman out of the crowded barn and into the cold, muddy streets of the village. Her thin dress clung to her frame, soaked through within moments. The burlap sack over her head drooped under the weight of the rain, but she didn't stumble. Her steps were light and sure, her silence unsettling. Villagers leaned out from doorways, their voices carrying through the wind. Look at him, dragging her like a stray dog. She probably doesn't even have a face under that sack. Thomas ignored them all. He kept a steady pace, his boots sinking into the muck with each step. The woman followed obediently, her wrists now free, but her hands clasped tightly together as though afraid to let them hang loose. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the town was far behind them. Only the sound of rustling trees and the patter of rain on leaves remained. Thomas paused and glanced over his shoulder. I don't know who you are, he said, his voice deep and rough, or what you've been through. You don't have to talk. Don't have to explain a thing. But you're safe with me now. She didn't answer, not even a nod. The rest of the walk was silent. The woman kept pace easily despite the thick underbrush and slippery stones. Thomas noticed how lightly she moved, like someone used to running barefoot, used to surviving without help. By the time they arrived at his cabin, the storm had eased to a drizzle. The small wooden house stood sturdy among towering pines, smoke curling from its chimney. Thomas opened the door and motioned her inside. Go on. She hesitated for the first time, then stepped into the warmth of the cabin. The smell of cedar and firewood filled the air. Thomas set his axe aside and stoked the fire higher. You can sit, he said, pulling out a chair at the table. I'll make tea. The woman lowered herself into the chair, quietly, her hands resting in her lap. The burlap sack still covered her head, water dripping onto the floorboards. Thomas placed a steaming mug in front of her and sat across the table. You can take it off if you want, he said softly. No rush. When you're ready. She didn't move. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. Each morning, Thomas rose before dawn to chop wood and check his traps, leaving the woman in the cabin with enough food and firewood to stay warm. Each evening, he returned to find the place tidier than he left it, the fire stoked, the floor swept, and a pot of stew bubbling gently on the stove. She moved around his cabin silently, graceful in her work, never removing the burlap sack from her head. Thomas didn't ask questions. He didn't press her to speak or reveal her face. He simply let her exist in his world, as she let him exist in hers. But at night, lying in his cot, he couldn't stop wondering, what had she endured? Why would someone so capable stand silent and hidden like a ghost? On the fourth evening, Thomas returned from the woods to find her sitting by the fire. The glow flickered across the coarse fabric of her sack, throwing strange shadows over her thin frame. "I caught a hare today," Thomas said, placing it on the counter. "We'll have stew tonight. Something better than dried bread. Finally." She didn't respond, as always. After dinner, Thomas brought out his knife and a small block of wood. He began carving in silence as the fire crackled. "You're good with your hands," he said after a long pause. "You've kept this place cleaner in 4 days than I managed in 4 years." Still no reply. "I know you're scared," Thomas murmured, his eyes focused on the wood shavings falling to the floor. "I don't know who hurt you, but I'm not them. You don't owe me anything, not your words, not your face. Just don't be afraid here." A long silence stretched between them. Then, so soft he almost missed it, a voice drifted through the air. "Clara." Thomas froze, the knife slipping from his fingers. Slowly he turned to her. "What did you say?" "Clara," she whispered again, her voice barely audible but steady. "Is that your name?" She nodded once. Thomas felt something unexplainable bloom in his chest. He'd spent years alone, thinking his heart was too scarred to feel anything for anyone again. But hearing her voice, just one word, felt like the start of something alive. "Clara," he repeated gently, "it suits you." For the first time since she'd arrived, he thought he saw her shoulders relax ever so slightly. The morning sun slanted through the cabin's window, casting a golden light across the worn wooden floorboards. Thomas had gone out early, his axe swinging over his shoulder as he trudged into the forest to gather firewood. Inside the cabin, Clara sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. For days, she had remained quiet, her sack still covering her head, even as she cooked, cleaned, and tended to the small home. But last night had been different. When she had spoken her name aloud, she felt something shift inside her, like a door unlocking after years of being shut tight. Thomas hadn't pressed her after that. He only repeated her name softly, like a prayer, and left her to her silence. But that moment lingered in her mind, echoing louder than the years of fear and humiliation she had endured. As she sat in the stillness, she reached up slowly and touched the knot tied at the back of the sack. Her hands trembled. What if he looks at me and recoils? What if he regrets rescuing me? She loosened the knot anyway. The sack fell forward and crumpled into her lap. Long, dark hair tumbled down her back. Her face, pale from lack of sunlight, framed by sharp cheekbones, was delicate but carried the traces of old pain. A faint scar ran from her temple to her jaw, a remnant of the night. Everything had been taken from her. The cabin door creaked open. Thomas stepped in, his arms full of firewood. He stopped dead in his tracks as his eyes fell on her. The sack was gone. For the first time, he saw Clara. She flinched under his gaze, her hands flying to her face. I can put back on," she stammered. It was the first full sentence she had spoken. "Don't," Thomas said gently, setting the firewood down. He crouched beside her, his voice low but steady. "You don't need to hide here. Not for me." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. They laughed at me, said no man would ever look at me again. That scar, she touched it unconsciously. Thomas reached out and took her hand away from her face. His rough fingers brushed against her scar, tracing it carefully. "Scars mean you survived. They don't make you less. They make you more." For a long moment, Clara stared at him, searching for any flicker of pity or disgust. There was none. Only quiet acceptance in his deep, forest-colored eyes. "You're safe now," Thomas said softly, "and you're not going back to them. Ever." For the first time in weeks, Clara moved freely around the cabin, the burlap sack gone for good. She tied her long hair back as she stoked the fire, humming softly under her breath. But the scar on her face still burned in her thoughts, a reminder of the night her life had been torn apart. That evening, as Thomas carved a piece of oak by the hearth, Clara finally spoke. "You must wonder how I ended up on that stage," she said softly, her voice almost lost beneath the crackle of flames. Thomas set down his carving knife and looked at her. "Only if you want to tell me." She drew a deep breath. "I was married once, to a man with more greed than kindness. He gambled away our land, our home, and when he couldn't pay his debts, he sold me." Her voice cracked. "They covered my head, tied my hands, and put me on that platform like cattle." Thomas's jaw tightened. "The man who called himself your husband, he's alive?" She shook her head. "No, he drank himself to death before they dragged me to auction." Thomas's anger simmered beneath the surface, but he forced it down. Standing, he walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They won't touch you again," he said firmly. "As long as I draw breath, no one will ever harm you." Clara's eyes shimmered. "Why are you so kind to me? You don't even know me." Thomas met her gaze. "I don't need to know your past to see your worth." The snow had begun to melt, and the first signs of spring peeked through the forest floor. Clara and Thomas spent their days working side by side, hauling water, planting seeds, chopping wood. At night, they shared quiet meals by the fire, the silence between them no longer heavy but comfortable warm. One evening, Thomas sat at the table with a small wooden box in his hands. He had carved it himself, smoothing every edge until it felt perfect. Inside lay a silver ring he had bartered for in town, a simple band, but one he hoped would hold meaning. "Clara," he said, clearing his throat, "I never thought I'd share my life with anyone again. But now, I can't imagine it without you." Clara's lips parted in surprise. He slid the box toward her. "I know I'm not a wealthy man. I don't have fine words or riches. But I can offer you safety, respect, and love if you'll have it." Clara's hands trembled as she opened the box, gazing at the ring through blurred vision. "Thomas, I never dreamed someone would see me as anything but broken." "You're not broken," he said. "You're whole, and you're strong." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was simple, held beneath the tall pines behind Thomas's cabin. There were no guests, no fancy clothes, only two hearts making promises to each other. "You may not have cost me much," Thomas said softly, placing the ring on her finger. "But you're the most priceless thing I've ever known." Clara smiled, her scar catching the sunlight like a faint silver line. "You didn't buy me, Thomas. You saved me." As they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last remnants of Clara's pain. In the quiet of the forest, a new chapter began, not of loneliness or fear, but of love, healing, and a future neither of them had dared to hope for.